if something needed to sit in the cooker for a while, that was just what the assignment was. It wasn't seen as like, oh, since you can't handle that, we'll just do it this way or that kind of thing. It was never seen in that light. It was always, oh, here's your assignment, and here's the thing that we're going to be putting our thinking on. And so, and then she would have my daughter say, okay, I'm going to put my thinking on whatever the thing was. And so my daughter was able to state that in her lesson. And then I was able to take like a perfect note, like, okay, this activity, think about this. This activity, think about this. And there was always a very clear purpose.
Welcome to the Time to Practice podcast. This is a space where we talk about music practice, the ups and downs that young musicians go through related to practice and learning music, and how we as parents, caregivers, and music educators can support the young musicians in our lives, support ourselves, and support each other. My name is Christine Goodner. I'm a music educator, author, and podcaster who has made it my mission to talk about music practice and to support educators and families looking to make home practice more effective and to reduce conflict and frustration in the practice room. I'm glad you're here. This episode is brought to you by two upcoming events, which I will mention quickly here and that you can find more information about on my website, suzukitriangle.com. The first is meant for parents and families supporting young musicians. It is a book club that we're going to have online based on the Beyond the Music Lesson book. And it's my big thank you gift for my newsletter subscribers. So don't worry if you're not a subscriber yet. You can find the link to sign up to attend and be added in the show notes or on the homepage of my website. If and when you become a member of the newsletter, this is a no-cost event that is my thank you to you. And then second, I have an event for teachers coming up in the new year. I will be offering my enrichment course, Setting Families Up for Success, one more time this school year. We will meet every other Friday starting January 9th online, and you can sign up for that on the SAA website and also find a link on my website as well. So please reach out if you have any questions. I'd love to have you join me for either or both of those events. You're listening to episode 107. I'm thrilled to be bringing you a two-part interview. You'll hear part two next week with someone who is always full of wisdom and insight each time we speak, a fantastic music educator who has studied pedagogy, child development, performance psychology, and more in her ongoing training past her master's in music. And in this first installment of our conversation together, she shares what she considers her best practices list from many years of practicing with her own children. Enjoy. All right, welcome everyone. I'm excited to be here today with Linda Piatt. And Linda and I have connected over the years in a number of different ways on the topic of Suzuki teaching, on parenting, on supporting families in our studios. And I'm really excited to have you today, Linda, to talk about teaching and especially practicing with our own children and their unique needs. So thanks for being here today.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to get to talk to you, and I really have benefited so much from all of the contributions you've made to the music community at large, and have taken a lot of your awesome advice. So I'm honored to be here.
Thanks for that. And I think I get a lot out of hearing you talk and interacting with you too. So I think we're both excited to speak to each other today. I'm excited for the audience to hear you as well. And I always like to kick off and start by asking people to share a bit about who they are and what they do in the world of music for the audience who might not know you yet.
Sure. So I live in San Diego, California with my husband, and we have a 15-year-old son who plays piano and bassoon, and we also have a 12-year-old daughter who plays violin. They've both been studying for about 9 years. I'm also an active performer in the area, in the region, I should say, and a teacher. I have an independent private studio where I teach violin and viola to, it comes and goes about 25 students.
Great. And you have given some wonderful lectures on deliberate practice, and we'll see if we weave any of that information into what we talk about today. But I do want to just talk about your journey supporting your own children in music specifically. I know our audience is always really appreciates hearing that parent perspective. And what would you like to share with listeners about what that's been like in your family?
Well, I'd like to share that it has been a journey for sure. Let's see, and sometimes a bumpy ride, but sometimes very smooth. And right now, I'm in a position, of course, we're all works in progress, but we've sort of arrived at a place where our kids primarily practice on their own. And so it's cool because it's given me really a great opportunity to reflect, like what have I done here? What might I have done differently? And, I've gotten to witness two very different kids. And of course, all the people out there have kids with their own unique, challenges and abilities and gifts and needs. And so everyone kind of has to find their own way. But through hearing perspectives of others, I've really learned a lot that's helped me, learn how to reflect and learn how to build skills to be a good practice partner with my children. It's definitely a skill in and of itself to to be that for those people. And so anyway, I hope that what I have to offer today will help your listeners and, at least create some sparks for them in some areas that they could potentially look into.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I know you've talked about, having some best practices that you've decided work really well for your kids. And what would you like to share about what some of those are?
Yeah. So of course, that's where everything sort of began for me. I began with, the advice of my children's private teachers. They both studied with Suzuki teachers from the beginning and other experts such as yourself, Edmund Sprunger. I've also learned a lot from your podcast and through some Suzuki enrichment courses by like Molly Gebrian and the neuroscience of practicing. And also another podcaster I really like is Stephanie Fay. So I've learned a lot from her as well. And maybe we could like put some links to some of those key episodes in the show notes. But one of the things I'm especially eager to share about coming up here and after I talk about best practices is the collaborative and proactive solutions model that's created by Dr. Ross Green. And he has a website and lots of resources. But this paradigm really, I think, presented one of the biggest shifts for me in terms of how I see my kids. And so I'll just kind of briefly, spoiler alert here, say that kids do well if they can, and that doing well for children is always preferable to not doing well. So his resources really help me understand how to look at concerning behaviors, and I've seen a lot of them, and that these are a form of communication, and that they usually mean that the child is struggling to meet an expectation that's out there. So, like I said, it really dramatically affected how I see things. It's made me more calm and empathetic in working with my own kids and my private students when I see things come up. But let me get back to best practices. So the ones I'd like to highlight are long-term commitment, establishing a daily practice routine, and also keeping the vibe positive. It feels good and all of that, but it also works, as I think Alice Joy Lewis said, right? So anyway, from the beginning, it was always just the case that we knew that our kids were going to have a long-term commitment to their music study. It was just in place. It was just kind of understood between my husband and I, and with our kids when they started, that this was just one of the things that we do, like academics, like taking care of our health. And for this, I really leaned into our home environment. I'm kind of an avid yogi. I practice yoga 6 days a week. I'm very committed. And I also practice, violin, viola every single day. And so even before my kids began lessons, they saw that. My husband is an ultra marathon runner and an athlete of all types, and also, very dedicated to his health and to our health and mental health and all of those things. So they really consistently saw this sort of dedication and long-term thinking as a sort of a core part of their environment. So that was just sort of, like in the background all the time. So I think there's also some research I want to point to in your book. I think it's in Music Practice Makeover, where you talk about the research behind when families have a long-term sort of view at the outset of music study and how that has correlated to the level of success and mastery that people have been able to achieve. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, I think that what I cited in my book was from The Talent Code by Daniel Coyle. I believe that's the case, and I can add a little note at the end of this podcast if we want to correct any info for listeners as we go. But there was a study about a long-term study of music students and who kept playing over a set number of years. And then they tried to measure what were the differences or similarities between the groups of students who didn't continue and those who did. And I think the they found the significant finding was that the students who were committed to doing this long term when they started were the ones that kept going, which is really interesting because everybody has really different challenges, as you mentioned before, and as I'm sure we'll talk about. And everybody's going through ups and downs, or some people have an easy time, or some people have a really challenging time. And I think it is that commitment that keeps us going to the instrument or deciding, like, this is a value that I have, is that my child has music in their life, for example, that gets us through and gets us creatively problem solving when the going is not easy.
Absolutely.
So it makes a lot of sense logically too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's always good to just reassure yourself that, when the little flare-ups come up, this too shall pass and we're in it for the long haul. The other thing I kind of wanted to establish here in terms of best practices is that practice happens every day. And this, I know it seems like a really strict thing to say, but I knew it was really important for for my kids, for their musical growth and for also the growth of their character. Dr. Suzuki talks a lot about how music study is in some ways a template for building character and all of that. And it's through the working through the problems. It's through building skills and coming to the work every single day that the character actually does develop. So I knew also, and this may have been like just me wanting to make sure I didn't have more work for me. That as soon as you start missing practice days, pretty soon any day gets called into practice and might be the day that you don't practice. So I didn't want to go down that road at all. So that again was something that I established right from the get-go. Routine, the typical routine kind of establishment best practices include, attaching practice to, okay, we always practice right before school, after breakfast. We practice after our snack when we come home from school, or we practice directly after dinner. Somehow, attaching things is a point that you've made that's really valuable. The other thing that I loved, there was a reel, I think it was maybe Zohara Rotem, and she was talking about the prosaic voice that we can use when we cue our children that it's time to practice, and making sure that we feel that inside first, and that we truly, because kids can sense when we're stressed out and they can hear it in our voice. But if I can bring myself to a place where I can say, practice time's in 5 minutes, I'll see you soon, I can't wait to see you. And then when the time comes, practice time, just using that sort of sing-songy, and it invites, but I'm looking forward to working with you because, we're all, really lucky to be able to witness the growth of these kids. And, it's a privilege to be able to practice with our children. And so when I truly sort of felt that, then I was able to bring on that tenor with my kids. There was still a lot of other stuff that they did. There were the stalling tactics. They had to use the restroom. Their nails were too long, or they were thirsty, or it was too hot or too cold, or they needed a snack. My daughter really was a big fan of having the family cat in the room. So we'd always have to find the cat. And she's here right now, actually with me. There was also the more kind of overt rebellions, like hiding under the table, having a temper tantrum, arguments. There were more subtle things that in retrospect, I found to be rebellion, which is kind of shutting down and not trying, which I think maybe ties into some of the perfectionist type things that you and Claire Allen have talked about, where, maybe they're aware that they might not be able to meet an expectation. And so it comes across as that. But some parents might see that as some kind of rebellion, this sort of not trying. So, and I had this really like idealistic vision when I went into, be a Suzuki parent, like, oh, I've got all this knowledge that I can impart to my kids, and I can't wait for them to, learn about all the things I offer. And I laugh because I see you're like laughing a little too, because like, as if they want me to like impart all of this to them and critique what they're learning and all of that. And that's when I was so happy that Edmund Sprunger came to town. Was a guest here brought here by our local Suzuki chapter, and he gave a parent talk, and that's when my eyes really opened. And I read that book, Helping Parents Practice, which probably is going to go in the show notes too. But Christine, will you, there was something maybe you can hit on what he said about how when a parent gives corrective feedback to a child, how this triggers like a fight or flight response.
Sure, sure. Well, I remember reading that when my kids were young and I was practicing with them too. And I can't remember like an exact moment because I got the book at some point in those early years of practicing with my kids. And that really struck me a lot too. And it's just that there are attachment relationships that our kids have with their parents. It's like survival instincts that like I need this person I depend on this person to eat, to have shelter for survival. And so if a parent figure that we depend on for all those things, if we feel like they're unhappy with us about anything, it feels like a threat to our survival. And that's when we can go into this fight or flight. And it's not logical. Like if you talked about it, it would be like, I don't think that, or it seems silly to even talk about. But there's just this nervous system level wiring that we would like our caregiver figures to approve of us because we need them to survive. And so it can feel like a threat to that survival if we're told, pinky's not curled or thumb isn't bent or whatever else. And that's why I think if you're listening as a parent, the teacher can say the same corrective feedback in the lesson and your child is not bothered by it. But if you say it, they might be on the floor or really upset. And there's just biology behind it that is not logical, but that really affects us. So yeah, I think it's really important. That really struck me as a parent too.
Yeah. And I think now I'm remembering also in Stephanie Faye's podcast where she talks about creating a safe space. And you know, I didn't really realize like if I was giving my kid an input, a piece of input that it was making them feel like vulnerable on some level in their very like core of their being. So Edmund Springer quoted, was it Joanne Bath as saying, children want to look good in the eyes of their parents. And so that's when I really realized my responsibility was so much greater than just getting the routine, getting the environment, and all of that. It's like, what can I do as a parent to increase the likelihood of success? So, like, whatever activity that they're doing teaches them the lesson without me having to be intrusive, and keeping that really minimal, and that might be something for teachers to think about as well as parents, not to be putting parents in the position of sort of being like, policing things or like, I'm going to raise my hand every time I see, your fingers flatten out on the piano keys or, every time I hear you rushing, I'm going to start tapping the beat. That those kind of interventions are really considered pretty intrusive. And so there are ways that teachers and parents can design learning experiences that negate the need for that type of intervention in practice. And so I'm trying to be pretty careful with that. That's why I love like piano accompaniment tracks
Mm.
rather than having to say like, don't rush or something.
Yes. Yeah, I think also like one thing I really have been loving is cello drones. On YouTube, you can have cello drones in different keys. And if a student's having trouble playing in tune, I'll just be like, we're playing that over the cello drone in A because your piece is in A. And, teach Suzuki students are listening a lot. They just self-correct and then nobody's scolding them or interrupting them or they're not feeling like they're failing. They just kind of intuitively figure it out because they want it to sound a certain way. And things like this can, we as parents, I as a parent did not want to be constantly butting heads with my child over stuff like that either. Like it makes the parent's job more pleasant. It makes the child's experience more pleasant, and everybody wants to practice more because it's not unpleasant as much. So
Yeah,
really important to think about.
very, very key. Yeah. And that,
Yeah.
I also learned that, certain types of feedback are more triggering than others. Um, so just talking about there's sort of this hierarchy of different types of feedback and I learned all this from you, so feel free to correct me, but that there are like the least intrusive to the most intrusive types of feedback. So verbal feedback would be on the less intrusive side. If you gesture, that would be considered slightly more intrusive, or something that's really visual or physical is considered much more intrusive. So that would be like, sometimes I do have some physical guidance, like if a child is learning how to bow or if they're learning how to do vibrato, there's a certain amount of parent participation and I have to get some buy-in on that because I know
Mm.
that there's a potential for some butting heads. So I always try to set that up too.
Yes, I do think that being touched while playing the instrument can really throw off some people's
Yeah,
uh, concentration, or also just really bother them in a way that can feel like can hurt your feelings as a parent if you're trying to help them, because normally, our kids might appreciate us hugging them or whatever else, but it just gets in the way of the child taking in the feedback we're trying to give. And then some, I would say for some students, the verbal, comments could be non-intrusive, but for others, it's going to be really, that's also going to really get in the way of them carrying forward. And
absolutely.
so yeah, it's one of those things where it's trial and error. Like what works for my child might not work for your child. And we just experiment and try not to blame ourselves. We're just learning about our child, and we're learning how can I give feedback in a way my child will take it in. Um, but it is helpful to think about what are the different ways. And
Yeah, and you're right. Every kid is going to react differently. Some kids react in like a more extreme way to that physical contact, and some people, like I have a student, if you give him a little support, he kind of goes into like a shutdown mode, and he like goes into like almost limp. And so for him, I avoid that because the result is really different than for some kids. It just helps guide them to a certain feeling that I can't really describe as well with words. And so, but it's different with everybody. And like you said, trial and error. And my daughter's private teacher is at the time was Dinah Volodka Staggs, who's a registered Suzuki teacher trainer, and she was so helpful in all the stages that we worked on with her. And she's really such a master at creating successful assignments for families. And if something needed to be small, it was small. If something needed to sit in the cooker for a while, that was just what the assignment was. It wasn't seen as like, oh, since you can't handle that, we'll just do it this way or that kind of thing. It was never seen in that light. It was always, oh, here's your assignment, and here's the thing that we're going to be putting our thinking on. And so, and then she would have my daughter say, okay, I'm going to put my thinking on whatever the thing was. And so my daughter was able to state that in her lesson. And then I was able to take like a perfect note, like, okay, this activity, think about this. This activity, think about this. And there was always a very clear purpose. And so I think as teachers, we can kind of keep that in mind. How specific and how clear can we be in our assignments so that families know what to do? And what can we do to create assignments where we know that they'll be put up against just enough challenge, but also not over challenge so they can still be successful, because overwhelm is a big trigger for behavior, for concerning behavior, and sometimes just for shutdown.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And so I just kind of wanted to throw that in. And what I didn't realize at the time was that what we were learning from her is deliberate practice, which is kind of a thing. And it's something I've talked about before, but basically that just means that you're practicing for something very specific and very targeted, and you're very goal oriented. And the more specific, the better. But what was so cool about it was then I could just sit there and be my daughter's cheerleader. I might be like managing the tasks a little bit, doing some of the note taking, but most of the time in her practice, because of the way the assignments were set forth, I was mostly just sitting there saying, hey, I really loved the way you watched your bow, and your sound was so beautiful. And it was things I could say really specifically and genuinely because she was, because the assignment was designed around her succeeding. The other thing I could sometimes do with the notes, and this is a good line, parents out there. Now let's see here. Let me check my notes. What is it that Mrs. Staggs said about how your hand should feel? Oh, I remember what she said, that kind of thing. And so I played a little bit, I went like a little bit beneath my own level to kind of try to help them like trigger their memory of something. And also it made it so that it wasn't really coming from me. I was just checking my notes. So that way of putting it really helped a lot.
I love that.
And the other thing is that, parents just trust your teacher. They've got a clear vision for your child. And if you have, if you want more specificity, feel free to ask questions at the appropriate time, and really stick to the teaching points, because, and those maybe for parents that are also musicians, you're going to witness all kinds of other issues, and you're going to want to fix them, and you're going to want to say something about them, and you're going to look at your very capable child and go, oh, they could handle that too. Why don't we just add in that they should also curve their fingertips or whatever? But when I stuck to the teaching points, that was the thing that got better. And then now I can look back and see that all the other stuff I was noticing did get addressed by our teacher. She was noticing everything too, and very deliberately picking one thing. And so that really, is one of those things you experience as a kind of a problem, you work through it, and now in retrospect, you can see how everything worked out.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that when you were talking earlier, because I hear from a lot of musician parents that it's a bit stressful to watch their kids practice because it feels like physically uncomfortable for them not to call out the other things they see that could also be worked on. They just feel just so trained into us as musicians, I think, to look for what's not there yet. And I love what you're saying about trusting the teacher because I do think that's the answer. And, that to me, if someone trusts me, they trust me enough to say, hey, could you explain or you see these other things too, right? And then you're going to get to them, right? I think that's also trusting me to have that conversation. But did you ever struggle with, wishing you could intervene, or that wasn't really an issue for you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay, good.
the musician parent spends like the whole lesson biting their tongue. Okay. We spend the whole practice day, with managing ourselves. We have to manage ourselves. We're asking our kids to manage themselves, right? And to show self-control and to build their character. And it's up to us to take good enough care of ourselves to model that for them and to have the control to know when it's appropriate to say something and when not to. There were all kinds of, back channel conversations between me and Mrs. Staggs at that time. And I got all kinds of reassurance and a lot of teacher training in all those moments. And I want to just quote her again because this idea is great. It's what she called the Mona Lisa smile. So this is like the neutral, pleasant expression. And you can train yourself to keep that in the midst of whatever chaos is going on. Because especially if the kid has some of those perfectionist tendencies, is looking to you for approval, the Mona Lisa smile can, if they see that with you, they know they're in a safe space and they can come back to the work that they need to put their thinking on. So, I always had a nice warm cup of tea or coffee. I was always wearing comfortable clothes. I planned this out and it really helped, model the self-regulation and it just, helped make the environment good vibes.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. I think it's just nice to hear the honest, like, this was hard for me too,
Oh yeah.
but it was worth it to not intervene. And I think that neutral, as a teacher, I always train my face to look neutral because I want my students to think how they thought about how they played, not just is my teacher happy with me or not happy with me, and even more so with parents, as we talked about for those attachment needs. Before we go today, here are a few of my takeaways from this conversation with Linda Piatt. I love the idea that Linda shared with us from Dr. Ross Green that kids do well if they can. And next week, we'll hear more about the journey Linda went on with her own kids that made that quote really resonate with her so much. So don't forget to come back and listen to the next half of our conversation for some background on that. The second takeaway that I took from this conversation was about designing assignments and feedback for success. I really think it's valuable to think about what we can do to cut down on friction or stress or overwhelm, even if we as the grown-ups don't quite understand why it's feeling that way to the child that we're working with. It's really helpful to think about, am I doing something probably with really good intentions, but that's accidentally causing some stress in some kind of way? And then we have an opportunity to adjust our tactics and help our child make the practice work for them. I think that's so important because we want our students to develop ownership and a love of music. And sometimes what would work for us or what feels logical to us needs a little tweaking to help our child be set up for success and for enjoying the process. And then finally, I think it's so important that idea of trusting your teacher, trusting that they are deliberately choosing something to focus on to help facilitate that deliberate practice and skill building that needs to happen. Have that behind the scenes chat with your teacher if you need to, if you're not sure that they're seeing everything you're seeing, or you're not sure why certain things are on the back burner right now. But if you can stick to the teaching point and the goal that your teacher has for your child, if you're in the practice room with them, helping them with their practice, it will really help keep the momentum going and keep things moving along smoothly. I can't wait to be back with you next week for the second half of this conversation. I will add some resources that Linda mentioned in this conversation to the show notes so that you can find them and connect with them as well. This coming Sunday is our book club discussion for Beyond the Music lesson, so you can join the newsletter through the form on my website, and I would love to see you there. In the meantime, happy practicing this week, everyone. Take very good care.